Hey guys, we are finally beginning our coverage of Hell's Kitchen Battle of the States here. Now, I know that I am a week late as we are now after episode 2. However, I was on vacation last week when the season started, and while I could have put out a video there while I was still away, I figured that considering that episode 1 was a non-elim and considering that I already had several other videos to make, that it was probably better pushing this one off a week until we at least got to an elimination. And so far, I feel like this has been a pretty normal season of Hell's Kitchen where you have this pretty over-the-top theme of each person representing a state and them just really hammering in that theme with people talking about how they're representing their respective state. But I still think this will make for an interesting ranking nonetheless here. Now with out of the way, we have 20 people to talk about and spend some more time. Let's go right into the video. So starting off at number 20, we have the first boot of the season, and here we have Carlos. And in a lot of ways, I do feel bad for Carlos, considering that he did fly in all the way from Alaska, only for him to really struggle during his brief stay, with him obviously being jet lagged during the Signature Dish Challenge, having a bad Signature Dish, and then immediately afterwards being knocked out before the first service due to this being an elimination challenge of him having to cook scallops. And while it was funny seeing him screw up the scallops despite him being from Alaska, which is known for seafood, it was still a situation where I did feel a bit bad for him, even though I feel like the edit wasn't really there for him to do particularly well, where while he did get a little bit of content talking about how he wants to put family first and how he had previously wanted to be a professional skateboarder, I still feel like he wasn't being set up particularly well there, with him even getting some dodo content at the premiere, with him dropping a bunch of silverware during the punishment. And obviously with him not doing well in either the Signature Dish or the Scallop Challenge, it just made sense for him to go out in this spot. And even though I still feel bad for him, he is now out of the game to where he's here at number 20. Now moving on to number 19, and we have the second boot of the season, and here we have Maddie. Now, I'll be honest, I wasn't expecting Maddie to be the first formally eliminated, where I felt like there were probably a few other people I was looking at a bit more compared to her, or I felt like she got an alright enough premiere with her talking a lot about how she's 21 and how she's accomplished beyond her years and having a good Signature Dish in that initial challenge. But then she obviously flounders a lot in the second episode, where we see her doing pretty poorly in the Scallop Challenge, with her being in the bottom grouping there, and then obviously doing pretty poorly in the service, where you have her not recalling the order, which really annoyed Ramsey, and her making tons of mistakes on the fish station, to where she was clearly put up by the red team there. Though with that said, it still felt like the blue team was a bit more of a disaster team in that service, with them clearly being more of a mess and them having more people that made mistakes, and with Chase seeming like someone I would have expected to be the first eliminated in the spot. I would have expected him to go out over Maddie, but instead Ramsey decided to eliminate her. Though with that said, by that point, I was probably not feeling great about her, even if she did survive this round, to where I do feel for Maddie a little bit. However, she is now out of the game as well, to where she's here at number 19. And with that, we have 18 people left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. But at number 18, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is someone who I just mentioned, and here we have Chase. Now, I did actually put together a power ranking after episode 1, and I actually had Chase at the very bottom of that, as he had a pretty non-existent premiere, with him getting 0 confessionals, and also not even getting a match out with Ramsey during the Signature Dish Challenge, to where we pretty much knew nothing about Chase after the premiere. And while he still had a good Signature Dish, with him getting a 4 there, I still feel like the fact that we pretty much know nothing about Chase after the premiere was a pretty bad sign for his overall chances of winning the game, even though there were still other people who had more actively negative edits compared to him. And then this episode, he does get more screen time, but it's mostly bad content, with him really doing poorly in the Scallop Challenge, which is pretty bad there, and then also having a pretty bad service, with him constantly screwing up flatbreads and even running out of cheese, to where Ramsey tells him to make salads, and he's eventually nominated for this service. And I feel like, considering that this was literally the first time he has gotten content, and with it being pretty bad after him getting pretty much nothing in the premiere despite him doing well there, is a pretty bad look to me. And as I alluded to a moment ago, I actually expected Chase to be the first formally limited player in this spot, and while Maddie ended up being taken out over him, I still don't really have much confidence in Chase doing well moving forward, to where I'm still expecting him to be a somewhat early boot here, considering his already bad track record, and considering that the edit doesn't seem to really care much for him outside of him making mistakes, to where I'm not feeling great about Chase at this point, and because of that, he is here at number 18. Now moving on to number 17, and we have yet another person who I feel like has been not looking great in the edit up to this point, and that person is Antonio. And Antonio was actually second from the bottom in my episode 1 power ranking for a similar reason to Chase, in the sense that he was also pretty quiet in the edit, with him not really getting a match hat during the Signature Dish Challenge, despite him doing pretty well there. Though he does at least get a confessional afterwards, talking about how his favorite room in the dorm is the couch, which I guess is something. And even in his episode 2, it's not particularly great, where he ends up making a mistake during the service and was even considered a nominee at a point, and he ends up getting into an argument with Bradley over it, and he does end up avoiding the block there, but I still think it wasn't a great showing for him there. However, I still think he is still someone who is not really being focused on the edit. I still feel like we don't know that much about Antonio at this point, and it's for that reason that I don't expect him to be a contender moving forward. Now, I could still see him like making it deeper into the season than Chase, but considering how he's not really been focused on the edit, and even the stuff that we have seen has not been particularly strong from him, I still have to leave him behind here at number 17. Now moving on to number 16, and we have yet another person who is not looking that great in the edit, but they at least had an alright service one, and that person is Paul. Now, I'm sure a lot of people would have had Paul at the very bottom after episode 1, considering he did have an actively bad premiere with him getting a lot of dodo content early on with him. He talks about how winning the money will go a long way, but then kind of stumbles into saying why he needs the money, saying how he had bought a house and needs a renovation for it. He also has a really awkward match chat with Ramsey, where he says that the reason he got into cooking was because he couldn't find anything else he enjoyed in college, and came off pretty awkward in that exchange. And also is a bad Signature Dish, and I feel like the premiere really painted Paul in a bad light, made him seem like someone who didn't have a lot of conviction, and obviously that's not particularly great there. And then he pretty much gets nothing in episode 2, where while he doesn't make any mistakes, he also doesn't get any content in that. And again, I feel like Paul's another person who we're not meant to be caring much for in the edit, and is another person where the content that he has gotten has been not particularly great there. And he's still someone who I am still expecting to be a somewhat early boot there. But the reason I do have him above Chase and Antonio is, again, he at least had an alright service one. He wasn't like in the firing line in that service. And while his premiere was pretty bad, I feel like the fact that he at least had an alright service was enough to have him a few spots higher, even though I still feel like there isn't much of a path for him in the game to where he's here at number 16. Now moving on to number 15, and we probably have the least prominent person in the edit at this point after episode 2, and here we have Ellie. And to me, Ellie is pretty much a non-factor in the show at this point, to where she's someone who we do learn a little bit about in the premiere, where she tells Ramsey about how she started culinary school at 14 and became a sous chef by 21. She calls herself a fiery little girl who works her butt off and doesn't take crap for no one, and then proceeds to get a 3 in the Signature Dish Challenge, which I found pretty funny there. But outside of that, we pretty much know nothing about her, where she doesn't get any other confessionals. We don't really know where she stands on her team, and also gets no content in episode 2, where while you could say that's a pro in the sense that she doesn't make any mistakes in that service, she also isn't propped up at all and isn't doing anything to stand out. And to me, Ellie just feels like an afterthought in the edit, to where it doesn't feel like the show is going out of their way to prop her up or to show us like where she stands in the game. And while she could make it further than the people we already talked about, in the sense that she doesn't have as many knocks to her game, I also feel like she doesn't have anything to stand out, and I feel like she's someone who I wouldn't expect to win the season by the end of it, even though I still think she's someone who could make it a bit deeper into the game. But as things stand, I'm not feeling great about Ellie's chances at this point, to where she's here at number 15. Now moving on to number 14, and we have another person who hasn't really been shown in the greatest light in the grand scheme of things, and I still feel like they're not really being presented as a major threat on the show. But at number 14, we do have Henry. Now, I did consider having Henry a little bit lower, considering that he has been shown making more mistakes, where we saw in this latest episode that he does make a mistake during the service where he puts up raw pork, gets kicked out of the service there, and obviously that's not particularly great there. And even beyond that, I feel like his edit has not been particularly notable, where in the premiere, he doesn't get anything until he's up in the Signature Dish Challenge, where even then, that's largely because he is last on his team, and it's to set up this tiebreaker with him and Lisa, talking about how like it's California and Texas going head to head, and that everyone that lives in California is moving to Texas. So again, take that for what you will. And he does get a match out talking about how he worked in the Air Force before going to culinary schools, and he does get a 4 in the challenge there. So Again, it's not bad content, but it's also not anything too special where it didn't feel like the show's going too out of the way to showcase Henry there, to where I could have easily seen him being skipped over had he not been last person to go up there. And even his content in episode 2 is also not overly impressive, where he gets one confessional plugging Hexaglad knives, which felt circumstantial, and he also gets content talking about how like Hell's Kitchen is a beast and how you can't get overconfident, which is followed up by him making a mistake. So I do feel like his edit is not really shining. And with him also making a mistake in episode 2, I feel like Henry is also not someone I'm looking too highly. And while realistically I could see him turning it around in future services, he is not someone I'm looking at as a contender at this point, to where he's here at number 14. Now moving on to number 13, and we have someone kind of similar to Henry, if I'm being honest, but number 13 we do have Kat. And Kat is another person who I feel like the show is not going too out of their way to showcase here, where she doesn't get a match chat during the Signature Dish Challenge, despite her getting a 4, which is a missed opportunity. And while she does get a couple confessionals beyond that, I feel like it's mostly just her reacting to her team. And I feel like we don't really know much about her there. And while she gets more to do in this episode, a lot of it feels situational, where a lot of it was simply because she was relevant to the episode, where obviously she was going to get a lot of content during the Scallop Challenge because she did well in the challenge and was selected from her team. And then she gets a lot of content during the service because she doesn't do well, where she makes mistakes in the fish station. She ends up messing up scallops, which is funny in hindsight. She ends up getting nominated for the service. And while she was clearly the least likely to go out of the 4 nominees, it was still not a great look for her to not do well in the first service. And at this point, I think she's in a similar ballpark to Henry in the sense that both of them are not getting overly impressive edits, and also are people who didn't do well in Service 1. So I feel like those things are major factors for me, and I feel like they're kind of around the same ballpark, to where while I still expect Kat to at least do fine in the short term, she's not someone I'm looking at as a contender at this point, to where she's here at number 13. Now moving on to number 12, and we have someone who has gotten a very strange edit up to this point. But number 12, we do have Bradley. And Bradley has had a bit of a roller coaster here, where he did have a solid episode 1, where he obviously does very well in the Signature Dish Challenge, getting a 5 there, and was even chosen for the tiebreaker in the Signature Dish Challenge when it came down to it. And beyond that, also gets a lot of personal content during the challenge as well, talking about how he started cooking after his mom fell into addiction and how he needed to take care of his brothers. And obviously a lot of that is good. Though at the same time, I was a bit curious how much of that was simply because he did exceptionally well in the Signature Dish Challenge. And I was actually pretty hesitant to have him as a contender, and I wanted to hold out to see how he would fare in future weeks. And I think I was kind of validated in episode 2, where he ends up really messing up in episode 2, where he gets a lot of content before the service talking about how he's struggling to keep up and how he is missing ingredients and how he is worried he's going to flop during the service, only for him to flop during the service, where he ends up struggling to keep pace and not really communicating well with the rest of his team. He ends up putting peas in the risotto, which is pretty funny. And he is eventually nominated for the service as well. And while he does end up surviving there and talks about how Ramsay kept him around because he saw something in him, I think this episode solidified that, one, Bradley is not a very consistent chef and someone who is going to have these up and down services, but also that the show is not really going that far out of their way to highlight Bradley, where while he does get a lot of positivity in episode 1 during the Signature Dish Challenge, he doesn't really get any content outside of that challenge, where we don't really get much of an introduction to him before the challenge. We also don't really hear much from him after the challenge either. And even in episode 2, a lot of his content feels circumstantial because he ends up doing poorly in the service as well, to where I'm not feeling that confident in Bradley at this current point. Now, at the same time, this could be the start of an underdog story for him, where as we saw with Ija from last season, to where I could see him recovering based off that. But I feel like just based off these first 2 episodes, it just feels a bit too hot and cold for me, to where I can't really have him too much higher than number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we're going back now to someone who I feel like has been pretty subdued in the edit up to this point. But at number 11, we do have Alexandra. And to me, Alexandra doesn't really have much going on in the show, really. Where I feel like her big moment comes in the premiere, where she has this pretty funny conversation with Ramsay, where she gives a very long-winded explanation of her culinary experience to where they're flashing forward, and obviously that's a pretty funny moment, but that's pretty much her only standout moment on the season so far, where beyond that, again, she does do well enough in the Signature Dish Challenge, and doesn't make any mistakes during the service, but she hasn't really gotten any content beyond her initial conversation with Ramsey, and it feels like she is more or less an afterthought in the edit, which is especially interesting considering that they at least saw like that moment with Ramsey as like her being funny, and through that you would expect her to be like this like comedic character in the show, but yet they're not even treating her like that. It feels like the show is just kind of treating her as this afterthought. So where I'm not feeling that great about Alexander at this point. Now, yes, like the fact that she hasn't really like messed up at all is probably a sign that she could be in it for a bit. But considering that she hasn't gotten any focus on the show beyond that one moment, and even that moment like not being overly complex for her, I feel like I can't really have her any higher than number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and we have yet another person who hasn't been invisible in the show, but also hasn't been as big of a presence as I would have liked. But at number 10, we do have Elena. Now, Elena does have a big enough premiere where early on she talks about how she's grateful for being picked for the cast. She also gets some focus during the Signature Dish Challenge, talking about how she struggles with it. She gets a conversation with Ramsey, talking about how she learned to cook after putting aluminum foil in a microwave, which is a funny moment, and says how she'd be happy with anything over a 2, which she ends up getting with a 3, which isn't that great, but whatever. So it's not like she doesn't get any content, but at the same time, I feel like it's not the most complex content in the world. I feel like there's definitely other people who were clearly meant to be rooting for her more than Elena, and I feel like she isn't being set up for a season-long story arc in the same way that other people are. And beyond that, like, she doesn't get much to do in episode 2, where while she does well enough in the actual service, she doesn't really get much focus in that episode, which is obviously not a great look there. So at the end of the day, I feel like Elena is just kind of middling in my view, to where while she's not invisible in the show and hasn't really done anything to really lower my view on her prospects in the game, I also don't feel like she's like a major focus on the show. I feel like she hasn't been set up the best compared to other people, and it's for the reason that I had to leave her around the middle of the pack here at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and this is another person who I could see moving up in future weeks. However, I feel like their actual presence on the show is not the most impressive in the world, but at number 9 we do have Anthony. And I think Anthony is sort of another tale of two episodes where I feel like his episode 1 is pretty strong with him getting a 5 in this Signature Dish Challenge. Also gets a conversation with Ramsey talking about how he grew up in Iowa, a small state, and how he's gotten the opportunity to move to Chicago and like work with great chefs, and how he got a Michelin star. So I feel like that's pretty good, though similar to Bradley, it feels like it's largely contained to the Signature Dish Challenge, and I was skeptical over how much he would have gotten had he not done well in the Signature Dish Challenge, as he doesn't really get much of an introduction beyond like that challenge. He doesn't get any confessionals before the challenge talking about that, doesn't get much content after the challenge either. And then episode 2 is pretty middling for him, where he ends up making a mistake during the service. That's not a great look. He also spends a lot of the episode complaining about Bradley, saying how Bradley's lost during the service, which I don't think is a great look, where you're dunking on your fellow teammates while not really elevating them yourself. And again, like, while it's not as disastrous of a service than Bradley's was, it's obviously not a great look when you're making a mistake during service. And considering that he doesn't get much complex content beyond like his match out with Ramsey in episode 1, it does make me think that he is, again, not someone that the show is going too out of their way to showcase. And while it's still relatively early in the season, and I could see Anthony recovering beyond this service, I feel like it's still not a great setup for him to start off the season, to where I did decide to have him here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and this may seem like a stretch here, as I'm sure some people would have this person much, much lower on the list here. However, I think this person actually has at least some potential to become like this major character in the season, but at number 8, I do have Cara Marie. Now, I'll admit that I may be rolling the dice here with this pick. I could see her flaming out relatively soon here, but I think the reason she is this high is I think she at least has some setup to a bigger storyline this season, which I think is more than what I could say for the other people on this list that I've already talked about. Where obviously she does have a very turbulent premiere where she is very adamant about making a vegan dish for her signature dish, and you have a lot of people complaining about that. And it's even worse when she ends up comparing that to her experience cooking with her grandmother growing up, how it's not really a tribute to her. And it's even worse when it ends up being a bad dish, only gets a 2 on the challenge. So obviously this premiere was not the greatest look for Cara Marie, and I feel like just based off that alone, like, you would definitely lean more towards this being a potential flame up for her. But I think episode 2 at least opened the door for this being a growth arc for Cara Marie, for her to be underestimated and to prove to people that she's a better chef than people let on. Or while she ends up doing poorly in the scallop challenge and is one of the bottom people selected for her team, she then follows it up with a pretty decent service where she gets content before the service talking about how she needs to prove to people that she can cook anything. She even arm wrestles with Paul, which is an interesting moment. And you have her taking on the meat station and saying how she's been grilling meat since before these people were born, and actually does pretty well on that station, to where I feel like there's at least some potential for Cara Marie to build upon this, to continue to defy people's expectations and to grow as a chef. Now, at the end of the day, I still don't think this is 100% guarantee. And for all I know, this could just be a one-off thing and that she could just go back to annoying her team and go back to stumbling moving forward. But I feel like the fact that she at least had one decent service, and for the show to like present this as like this crowning moment for her, is at least enough to where I could have her this high, to where there could definitely be this potential for Cara Marie to build upon this. But I think with things still being a bit up in the air over her, I did decide to leave her behind here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this is someone who I did kind of debate over their placement here, whether they should be lower or not, but at number 7 we do have Jaden. And to me, Jaden is someone who didn't get nothing on the show, but is another person who I feel like he didn't get the most complex content in the world, where during the premiere, like, he does get a little bit talking about how he's worried about not being picked for the cast. And while he does eventually get picked, I feel beyond that, we don't really learn anything about him. He doesn't get a conversation with Ramsey. We don't really get any personal content from him, which is a bit of a red flag in my eyes. Even though he does pretty well in the Signature Dish Challenge, getting a 4. Now, he does get a bit more in episode 2, where he talks about how like he's from Martha's Vineyard and how he's good at seafood and how he's better than his fellow landlocked chefs, which is obviously set up for him doing well in the Scallop Challenge. Though at the same time, that does feel pretty circumstantial, where I felt like he was only getting that content because he does well in the Scallop Challenge. And beyond that, like, he doesn't get anything during the service, to where I was a bit conflicted over Jaden here. I think there's definitely an argument for him being lower, considering that his edit at this point is not overly spectacular, and I feel like we definitely have learned more about other chefs compared to him. And again, I did very much consider having him lower, though with that said, I feel like the fact that he at least got some content before being picked for the cast is at least some setup for him, like taking the most out of the opportunity. And even then, like, the fact that he did well in the challenge to begin with is at least enough of an argument for him being at least somewhat high on the list, to where he's here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and we have someone who got a lot more in the premiere than Jaden did, though at the same time, I am questioning how much of it is truly set up for them doing well. But at number 6, we do have Sydney. And Sydney got quite a bit in the premiere, where she ends up getting the first confessional of the season, talking about how she doesn't want to be shown in the introductory video that they do, only for them to show her in the video, which is pretty funny there. Gets another funny moment during the challenge, where she talks about how like cooking in a dress is not the greatest idea in the world. And also gets personal content where she talks about how she was diagnosed with Crohn's disease at age 12 and how she was told that she shouldn't be a chef, but told them to F off, which is obviously notable there and could be the storyline for her of her being underestimated and how like she is defying the odds. Though at the same time, she follows it up with a not great episode 2, where her only confessional in that episode is her plugging hexaclad knives, which is pretty interesting. And beyond that, doesn't really get much to do in the service. So I'm not entirely sure what to make of Sydney's edit at this point, where on one hand, she does have this very solid personal content and set up to the storyline in the future with her having Crohn's disease and her like defying the odds of her being a chef in the kitchen. But on the other hand, she also gets plenty of ditzy moments as well, like early on the premiere and even in episode 2, to where I'm not entirely sure like what we're supposed to be thinking of Sydney at this point. And while I think there's definitely a lot of potential for her to be like this serious figure and someone who we're meant to be rooting for, I feel like there's just enough holding her back to where I can't really have her any higher than number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and this is someone who I feel like had a mostly fine edit. And while I want to consider it over the top, I still think there's at least some room for him to grow. But at number 5, we do have Chris. And to me, Chris has had a fine edit so far, where during the premiere, he gets a lot of focus during the Signature Dish Challenge, talking about how he plans to use quail, which is something that people don't normally use. And he ends up doing fairly well with it, where he ends up getting a 4 in the challenge, which is pretty good. He also gets some decent personal content, talking about how he works as a culinary instructor in a prison, which is pretty good. He also talks about how he's the chosen one for representing New Jersey, which is, again, somewhat noteworthy there. And then we get to episode 2, where he ends up winning the punishment pass, which is also a great look. However, he does make a mistake during the service where he tries to remove the peas from Bradley's risotto with his hands, which ends up annoying Ramsey. Though at the same time, I feel like it wasn't a major focus in the service, and he isn't really considered a nominee despite this mistake. So I do feel like Chris comes out of this episode looking good for the most part. I feel like there's definitely at least enough positives to where I could see him moving up in the future. Though with that said, I feel like there isn't as much positive compared to other people to where I can't have him too high, but I feel like it's at least a good enough start to have him here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and I would consider these my main contenders at this point in the season, and it's just a matter of ordering them. But number 4, we actually have the highest ranked member of the blue team, and here we have John. And I feel like this was a pretty solid showing for John across these first 2 episodes here, with him having a pretty notable premiere, with him having quite a bit to do early on in the episode, with him talking about how he's the last to be selected for the cast, and him saying how this is his turn, that he's not just representing himself, but representing Georgia, how the Lord said that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, which is a pretty good line there. Has a pretty notable scene with Ramsey during the challenge, talking about how he lives on a homestead and has 6 kids, how he ended up making chicken and waffles, which is a funny moment, but still doing well in the dish challenge. Emily doesn't get much to do in episode 2 with him just being on table side and not really having many mistakes there. I still feel like it was probably fine for the most part, considering that he still got a lot to do in the premiere anyway. And with him clearly being a standout on the blue team, I am expecting a lot out of John here. Now, with that said, I could still see him being a big character, someone who is a bit overexposed in the edit, and also someone who could eventually flame out, but I feel like from the content that we saw from him in the premiere, and even in episode 2, I feel like pretty good about John for the most part, to where he is here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and as I alluded to a moment ago, the top 3 are all members of the red team, as to be honest, I feel like the red team probably has more of the contenders and has less weak links at this point. And it's just a matter of ordering them. But at number 3, I did decide to go with Anaya here. And I feel like Anaya had a pretty strong showing across these first 2 episodes here, where I feel like she had a pretty notable premiere where while she doesn't get a match chat with Ramsey, we still got to know her pretty well, with her being the first selected for the cast and her saying that Ramsey said her name right. She gets a set up relationship with Jada early on, talking about how they're going to be friends, but they're also going to be fierce competition, which is all pretty good. She ends up doing pretty well in the Cinder Dish Challenge, getting a 4. And then she does pretty well in episode 2, where she ends up winning the punishment pass on the red team there, and also doing well enough in the service to where she doesn't make any mistakes. And I feel like Anaya is clearly meant to be set up as a pretty competent chef, someone who is meant to be taken seriously as a competitor. Though with that said, I think a major issue for her is I feel like she doesn't get any personal content in the premiere, where I feel like we don't really know much about Anaya as a person outside of her relationship with Jada. And while we could still get more of that moving forward, I feel like that is a big enough issue to me to where I can't really have her as my frontrunner at this current point. But still, I feel like her content was strong enough to where she is here at number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and we have yet another chef who I feel like has demonstrated a lot of ability across his first 2 episodes and also got pretty decent content. But at number 2, I did decide to go with Jada. And I think Jada is clearly meant to be set up as a pretty big threat on the season, with her doing pretty well across these first 2 episodes, getting a 5 in the Cinder Dish Challenge, also doing pretty decently in the Scallop Challenge, to where while she doesn't win, she is selected in the top of her team, and also does pretty well in the service, where she's shown making a good dish, and is clearly one of the better performers on the red team there. And on top of that, I feel like she also gets a solid edit where, for one, she gets a lot of personal content talking about how, like, others should be intimidated by her as she's representing Florida and the flavors are bright and beautiful. Talks about how she started from a young age, and while others were watching cartoons, she was watching Gordon Ramsay, which is a pretty notable moment there. Talks about how she always had to prove herself. I feel like that's pretty good. And I think we also get a lot of people talking about Jada as well, where we obviously get the setup relationship with Anaya, talking about how they're going to be friends. You have other chefs talking about how Jada is like this pretty big threat. And I think it's pretty clear that Jada is meant to be seen as a pretty competent chef, someone who is going to be a major force on the season, to where I would expect Jada to make a somewhat deep run here, to where unless she gets like sniped down the Cook for Your Life challenge, as we saw with Anthony last season, I would expect Jada to make it pretty deep into the season, which is all pretty good there. The reason she's not number 1, though, is I do think she is a bit overexposed, and I do think there is this element of her like being propped up as this threat that could eventually be sniped out of the game, someone that could be overtaken at some point. We're considering that Jada is already talking about how she is like clearly the best one out there, and also the fact that people are already talking so much about Jada right at the bat makes me a bit worried that while she could do very well early on, that over time she could eventually be overtaken and that we could start to see more of her flaws down the road. But even with that, I still think Jada is clearly meant to be here for a bit in the game, someone who is clearly meant to be one of the anchors for her team, and that's a major reason why she's still here at number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Hell's Kitchen Battle of the States at this current point is Lisa. And I did debate this placement between her and Jada here, as I still think Lisa is someone who has been pretty prominent in the edit up to this point, and someone who already feels pretty accomplished in the game to where she does get a 5 in the Signature Dish Challenge, also does pretty well in the Scallop Challenge to where she's chosen to be one of the best on her team, and also does well enough in the service to where she doesn't make any mistakes there. So I do feel like Lisa already kind of stands out in that regard. And it's also someone who has gotten a pretty notable edit as well, to where in the premiere she gets content early on talking about how Ramsay has picked her out of thousands, which is a good feeling. Also gets a lot of personal content talking about how she had to leave her cooking position after having a child, and how she's on the show to rediscover her passion for cooking, which I feel like is a pretty solid setup for a storyline there, and was actually a major reason why I decided to go with Lisa over Jada, as I feel like this growth arc for Lisa is probably something that Ramsay would connect with more than someone like Jada, who talks as if she's already like the best of the best. And while I probably would be higher on Jada if this were Survivor, where I tend to look down upon Journey edits more on Survivor, as those typically don't lead to a win, I feel like on something like HK, I think something like that would probably play to Lisa's favor more. The fact that she does want to like grow, and the fact that she wants to use the show as this chance to rediscover her passion for cooking. And I could see that leading to her doing well, and we're already seeing her doing pretty well, and is being presented as this competent chef. So I feel like those things are a major reason why I did decide to go with Lisa over Jada. And overall, I feel like Lisa's probably set up the best to go on to win the season at this current point. And obviously, while it's still only episode 2 and things could definitely change in the episodes to come, I feel like with the way things currently stand, I did decide to have Lisa here at number 1. And there we go, that'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so be on the lookout for that. And I'm also doing my weekly podcast with Flint Masters, Gem, and Ultra over on Flint Masters channel. So if you want more HK content aside from this, be on the lookout for that. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube memberships, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.